Picture this. It's September 13th, 1940. High above the Chinese city of Chongqing, 30 Chinese fighters are climbing to intercept what they believe is just another small Japanese raid. But as they reach altitude, they encounter something that will change aerial warfare forever. 13 sleek, silver aircraft unlike anything they've ever seen. No insignia yet. These are still experimental fighters, flown by Japan's most elite pilots on their first combat mission. Within minutes, 27 Chinese aircraft are spiraling toward Earth in flames. Not a single Japanese plane is lost. The Chinese pilot reports that reached Allied intelligence seemed impossible. Enemy fighters of unknown type demonstrated speed and maneuverability far exceeding any known aircraft. Our formations were decimated. What the world had just witnessed was the combat debut of the Mitsubishi A6M Zero, a fighter so revolutionary that Allied commanders would dismiss early reports as Chinese exaggeration. But this wasn't exaggeration. This was the birth of Japan's aerial supremacy and the beginning of what would become the most feared fighter aircraft of the early Pacific War. But here's the shocking truth that makes this story so compelling. This miracle fighter that seemed unstoppable would become a death trap for its own pilots. By war's end, an astounding 90% of Zero pilots would be dead, not just from enemy fire, but from the very design philosophy that made their aircraft legendary. While Allied intelligence dismissed reports from China as impossible, the Zero was already proving that Japan had achieved something extraordinary and terrifying. This is the story of how Japan's greatest aviation triumph became its most tragic failure. Our story begins in 1937 when the Imperial Japanese Navy issued what seemed like an impossible challenge to Japanese aircraft manufacturers. They wanted a carrier-based fighter that could fly further than any existing aircraft, outmaneuver any opponent, pack devastating firepower, and still be light enough to operate from the rolling deck of a ship at sea. But one man believed it could be done. Jiro Horikoshi, chief designer at Mitsubishi, saw opportunity where others saw impossibility. As he would later write in his memoirs, the Navy's requirements seemed contradictory. But I realized that if we could achieve them, we would create not just a superior fighter, but a weapon that could change the course of history. Horikoshi's approach was revolutionary and dangerous in equal measure. While American and European fighters were becoming heavier and more armored, he went in the opposite direction. The Zero would be built like a samurai sword, incredibly sharp and effective, but also brittle and unforgiving. Every decision in the Zero's design reflected a uniquely Japanese military philosophy. That skill and spirit could overcome material disadvantage. The aircraft's frame was constructed from a revolutionary lightweight aluminum alloy with the entire fighter weighing just under 2,000 kilograms, about half the weight of comparable American fighters. To achieve this impossible lightness, Horikoshi made choices that would prove both brilliant and fatal. The Zero's skin was paper thin, just 1.2 millimeters at its thickest points, and in some areas only half a millimeter thick. An American pilot could literally dent the aircraft just by stepping on it wrong. There was no armor protecting the pilot, no self-sealing fuel tanks, no redundant systems. As Horikoshi himself acknowledged, we created an aircraft that demanded perfection from its pilots because there was no margin for error. But the gamble seemed to pay off spectacularly. When the prototype first flew in 1940, it exceeded every specification. The Zero was faster than Britain's legendary Spitfire, more maneuverable than Germany's Messerschmitt Bf 109, and had a combat radius of nearly 2,000 miles, unheard of for a carrier fighter. The Zero's true secret weapon, however, wasn't its engineering. It was its pilots. Japan had created what was arguably the world's most elite naval aviation program. The Imperial Japanese Navy's pilot selection process was so brutal that some years, fewer than 100 candidates survived training out of thousands who applied. These weren't just pilots. They were aerial samurai, trained to view their aircraft as an extension of their own bodies. Lieutenant Commander Minoru Genda, one of the architects of Japanese naval aviation, believed firmly that a superior pilot in an inferior aircraft will defeat an inferior pilot in a superior aircraft every time. We chose to create superior pilots. The training was merciless. Cadets who showed even slight hesitation or fear were immediately dismissed. Those who remained underwent years of intensive flight training, aerobatic instruction, and combat simulation. By the time they earned their wings, these pilots had logged more flight hours than most Allied aviators would see in their entire careers. They were taught to fly by instinct, to push their aircraft to its absolute limits, and to trust in their superior skill above all else. As one Zero pilot would later write, "We were told that our aircraft had no armor because we would never be hit. We were told our fuel tanks did not seal because we would never be shot. We believed this because we had never been beaten." This philosophy worked brilliantly as long as these elite pilots survived. Meanwhile, in Washington and London, intelligence reports from China were being filed away with skeptical comments. The described performance seemed impossible. How could a Japanese aircraft, Japan, which many Western military leaders still viewed as technologically inferior, outperform the best fighters from Britain and Germany? U.S. Army Air Corps intelligence files from 1940 contained dismissive notes like Chinese accounts appear greatly exaggerated. No single-engine fighter can possess the described combination of speed, range, and maneuverability. This skepticism would prove catastrophic. While Allied pilots trained for combat against known German and Italian aircraft, they remained completely unprepared for what Japan was bringing to the Pacific. The few Allied observers who took the report seriously were ignored or overruled. Claire Chennault, the American pilot leading the Flying Tigers in China, repeatedly warned Washington about Japanese air superiority. As Chennault would later write in frustration, "I sent detailed intelligence reports describing Japanese fighter capabilities to Washington every month. They were filed away unread while our pilots prepared to fight an enemy that no longer existed." By December 1941, Japan was ready to test its aerial superiority against the world's most powerful navy. The Zero had been refined through nearly 2 years of combat experience in China. Its pilots were veterans with hundreds of combat hours. The aircraft itself had proven its dominance beyond any doubt. What happened next would shock the world and announce Japan's arrival as a major military power. December 7th, 1941. At 7:55 a.m. Hawaiian time, the world changed forever. Lieutenant George Welch was one of the few American pilots who managed to get airborne during the attack. Flying his P-40 Warhawk, he found himself face to face with a mysterious Japanese fighter that intelligence had dismissed for over a year. I had never seen anything like it. They were everywhere, moving like nothing we had in our inventory. Our boys were falling out of the sky, and there wasn't much we could do about it. Welch was one of the lucky ones. He survived and even claimed several kills. But most American pilots that morning experienced firsthand what Chinese aviators had been reporting for months. The Zero was in a class of its own. Captain Mitsuo Fuchida, who led the Pearl Harbor attack, would later write, "Our Zeros moved through the American defenses like hawks among sparrows. The enemy fighters that managed to take off were simply outclassed in every dimension of aerial combat." In a single morning, the Zero had announced Japan's aerial supremacy to the world in the most dramatic way possible. What followed was 6 months of almost uncontested Japanese dominance. The Zero spearheaded Japan's expansion across the Pacific, escorting bombers from the Philippines to the Dutch East Indies, from Wake Island to the Indian Ocean. In April 1942, during the Indian Ocean raids, Japanese carriers struck British bases in Ceylon, modern-day Sri Lanka. Zero pilots engaged Hawker Hurricanes, the same fighters that had helped win the Battle of Britain, and repeatedly outmaneuvered them in dogfights. British pilot Flight Lieutenant R.T. Holmes reported after barely surviving an encounter, "The Japanese fighter simply turned inside us at will. Every evasive maneuver we tried, they countered effortlessly. It was like fighting ghosts." June 4th, 1942. During the Aleutian Islands campaign, Petty Officer Tadayoshi Koga took off from the carrier Ryujo for what seemed like a routine mission, bombing Dutch Harbor in Alaska. What happened next would change everything. Koga's Zero was hit by ground fire that severed an oil line. Following standard procedure, he headed for Akutan Island, which had been designated as an emergency landing site for Japanese pilots. But the ground there was treacherous, a soft, marshy bog that aircraft wheels couldn't handle. When Koga touched down, his landing gear immediately dug into the soft earth. The Zero flipped onto its back, breaking the young pilot's neck instantly. For weeks, the aircraft lay there undisturbed, its secrets intact. Then, on July 10th, an American PBY Catalina on patrol spotted something metallic gleaming in the marsh. Lieutenant William Bill Theus, the pilot who discovered the wreck, radioed back. "I have spotted what appears to be an intact enemy fighter. Recommend immediate recovery operation." The implications were staggering. For the first time in the war, the Allies would have access to Japan's most closely guarded military secret. The recovery operation was a massive undertaking. The Zero had to be carefully extracted from the bog, crated, and shipped 2,400 miles to Naval Air Station North Island in San Diego. There, a team of engineers and test pilots began the most important aircraft analysis of the Pacific War. What they discovered would revolutionize Allied fighter tactics. Test pilot Eric Sanders flew the captured Zero extensively and reported, "The aircraft is remarkably agile at low speeds and has exceptional range, but it has critical weaknesses. At high speeds, the controls become heavy and unresponsive. The aircraft cannot handle negative G-forces without the engine cutting out, and the structure is surprisingly fragile." The tests revealed three critical vulnerabilities. First, the Zero's ailerons stiffened dramatically at high speeds, making it nearly impossible to roll effectively above 300 miles per hour. This meant Allied fighters could escape simply by diving away at high speed. Second, the float-type carburetor would flood during negative G maneuvers, causing the engine to cut out. Any inverted maneuver or pushover dive would leave a Zero pilot temporarily powerless. Third, and most critically, the aircraft's legendary lightness came at a devastating cost. The skin was so thin that even rifle-caliber bullets could cause catastrophic damage. The lack of armor and self-sealing fuel tanks meant that any hit to the fuel system would likely result in an immediate fire. The Thatch Weave tactics that worked. Even before the captured Zero provided detailed intelligence, some Allied pilots were already developing tactics to counter Japanese superiority. Lieutenant Commander John "Jimmy" Thatch had been thinking about the problem since the first reports from China. The concept was elegantly simple. Two fighters would fly as a team, and if one was being chased, both would turn toward each other. The Zero, pursuing the first aircraft, would suddenly find itself flying directly into the guns of the wingmen. Thatch tested his weave formation and training and found it worked brilliantly. He would later write, "We couldn't outturn the Zero, but we could outthink it." Teamwork could overcome individual superiority. June 4th to 7th, 1942. The Battle of Midway would prove to be more than just a tactical victory for the United States. It was the beginning of the end for the Zero's elite pilot corps. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, the same pilot who had led the Pearl Harbor attack, was aboard the carrier Akagi when American dive bombers broke through the Zero Combat Air Patrol. He watched in horror as 3 Japanese carriers were destroyed in a matter of minutes. In his post-war memoir, he wrote, "In those terrible minutes, we lost not just our ships, but the core of our most experienced pilots. Men who had trained for years, who had flown in China and led our victories across the Pacific, gone in an instant." The loss wasn't just numerical, it was generational. Japan's naval aviation had been built around a small core of supremely skilled veterans. At Midway, many of these irreplaceable pilots went down with their carriers or were lost when their Zeros ran out of fuel trying to return to bases that no longer existed. Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga, one of Japan's most experienced Zero pilots, transmitted his final message during the battle. "I have fuel remaining for only one more attack run. I will not return." He never did. By late 1942, the intelligence gathered from the captured Zero was bearing fruit. American aircraft manufacturers were rushing new fighters into production, each designed specifically to exploit the Zero's newly discovered weaknesses. The F-6F Hellcat was the most important of these. Grumman engineers had incorporated every lesson learned from the captured Zero analysis. The Hellcat was faster, more heavily armed, and built like a tank compared to the fragile Zero. When test pilot Corky Meyer first flew the Hellcat prototype, he reported, "This is the airplane that's going to beat the Zero. It's got the speed to engage or disengage at will, the firepower to destroy them quickly, and the armor to survive their attacks." The Vought F-4U Corsair brought even more dramatic advantages: blistering speed and devastating firepower from 6.50 caliber machine guns. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning added twin-engine reliability and the range to escort bombers deep into Japanese territory. But perhaps most importantly, these new fighters were being produced in numbers that Japan simply couldn't match. By 1943, American factories were rolling out fighters at a rate of thousands per month, while Japan struggled to build hundreds. As 1943 progressed, a more insidious problem began affecting Zero squadrons. The quality of their pilots was declining rapidly. The elite veterans who had made the Zero legendary were being killed faster than they could be replaced. Japan's training system, designed to produce small numbers of highly skilled pilots, couldn't scale up to meet wartime losses. Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's top aces with 64 victories, observed the change with growing alarm. The new pilots arriving at our squadrons had perhaps 1/10 the training hours of the men they were replacing. We were sending children to fight men. The contrast with American pilot training was stark. While Japanese flight schools were shortened and simplified due to fuel shortages and time constraints, American training programs were being expanded. By 1943, new U.S. Navy pilots were arriving in the Pacific, with an average of 525 flight hours, compared to Japanese pilots who might have as few as 100 hours total flight time. For an aircraft like the Zero, which depended entirely on pilot skill for survival, this was catastrophic. June 19th to 20th, 1944. The Battle of the Philippine Sea would demonstrate just how completely the balance of power had shifted. Admiral Mark Mitchell, commanding Task Force 58, had assembled the most powerful carrier force in history, 15 aircraft carriers with over 950 aircraft, including hundreds of the new Hellcats. When Japanese Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa launched his strike force of 430 aircraft, most of them Zeros, they flew into what can only be described as a massacre. Lieutenant Alexander Vrasiu of VF-16 shot down 6 Japanese aircraft in a single mission. His radio transmission captured the moment. "This is like an old-time turkey shoot down here." The results were devastating for Japan. In 2 days of fighting, Japanese naval aviation lost 645 aircraft and most of their remaining experienced pilots. American losses were just 123 planes. Commander David McCampbell, who would become the Navy's top ace, later wrote, "The Japanese pilots we faced in 1944 bore no resemblance to the skilled veterans of 1941 to 42. They flew predictably, made basic errors, and seemed overwhelmed by modern aerial combat. The Zero, once the undisputed master of Pacific skies, had become easy prey for newer fighters flown by better-trained pilots." By late 1944, the situation for Zero pilots had become desperate. Japan was losing aircraft and pilots at an unsustainable rate, while American industrial production was hitting its peak. The captured Zero secrets were now incorporated into Allied training manuals distributed to thousands of pilots. Every American, British, and Australian aviator in the Pacific knew exactly how to fight a Zero, and more importantly, how to survive the encounter. Meanwhile, Japan's attempts to develop a successor to the Zero had largely failed. The A7M Reppu showed promise, but only 9 were ever built. Resources were scattered across too many competing designs, and none would arrive in time to change the war's outcome. October 25th, 1944. As American forces closed in on the Philippines, Japan made a decision that would transform the Zero from a precision fighter into something else entirely, a manned missile. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, facing the reality that conventional tactics could no longer stop the American advance, authorized the formation of the first official kamikaze units. The aircraft that had once symbolized Japanese technological superiority would now become the instrument of a desperate suicidal strategy. Lieutenant Yukio Seki, chosen to lead the first organized kamikaze attack, understood the tragic irony. Before his final mission, he told a war correspondent, "I am not going on this mission for the Emperor or for the Empire. I am going because I was ordered to go. But I want you to know that this is not what we trained for. We were taught to fight and survive, not to die." The Zero, designed by Jiro Horikoshi to be the perfect carrier fighter, was about to become the perfect kamikaze weapon. Its long range allowed it to reach distant targets. Its agility helped it evade interceptors, and its light construction, once a liability in combat, made it ideal for carrying heavy explosive payloads. But this transformation came at a horrific human cost. By early 1945, Japan's pilot training system had completely collapsed. Fuel shortages meant that new pilots might receive as little as 40 hours of flight time before being sent into combat, or to their deaths. Commander Minoru Genda, the architect of Japanese naval aviation, who had once boasted about creating superior pilots, watched his life's work crumble. He would later write, "We were no longer training pilots. We were teaching young men the bare minimum needed to take off, find a target, and die." It was the complete opposite of everything we had built. The contrast with their opponents was stark. American pilot training programs were producing aviators with an average of 600 flight hours, supported by advanced aircraft, comprehensive tactical instruction, and unlimited fuel for practice. Ensign Teruo Yamaguchi, who survived the war after his kamikaze mission was canceled, described the reality. "Most of us had never fired the Zero's guns in training. We had never practiced air-to-air combat. We knew only enough to fly straight and crash into enemy ships. They told us we were warriors, but we were really just guided bombs." The statistics tell a horrifying story. Of the approximately 400 Zero pilots who had achieved ace status, 5 more victories, during the war, fewer than 40 survived to see Japan surrender. That's a casualty rate of 90% among the most skilled pilots. Exactly the figure that opened this story. But the losses extended far beyond the aces. Of the roughly 10,500 Zero fighters built during the war, most were lost along with their pilots. In the final year of the war alone, Japan lost over 7,000 aircraft and their crews, many in kamikaze attacks that achieved minimal tactical results. Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai, one of the few elite pilots to survive, put the tragedy in perspective. "We began the war with perhaps 3,500 of the finest pilots in the world. By war's end, I could count the survivors on my fingers and toes. The Zero didn't just fail as an aircraft, it consumed the men who flew it. The kamikaze campaigns, while creating dramatic headlines, proved largely ineffective. Most kamikaze aircraft were shot down before reaching their targets, their inexperienced pilots unable to penetrate the sophisticated air defenses of the American fleet." August 15, 1945. As Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender, the last Zero combat missions were being flown, not against enemy forces, but to prevent Japanese pilots from defying the surrender order. Some die-hard pilots attempted to continue fighting, refusing to accept defeat. Other Zeros were tasked with intercepting these rogue aircraft to prevent incidents that might jeopardize the peace negotiations. Captain Yasuna Kozono, commanding the 302nd Air Group, had to physically restrain some of his pilots from taking off on unauthorized suicide missions. He later recalled, "These young men had been taught that death was preferable to defeat. When defeat came anyway, many couldn't understand why they were still alive." The final irony came on August 30th, when Allied occupation forces landed in Japan. Some of the aircraft that escorted them to ensure their safety were the same Zeros that had once dominated Pacific skies. In the end, the Zero's story became a cautionary tale about the dangers of pursuing perfection at the expense of adaptability. The same design philosophy that made it legendary in 1940, extreme lightness, long range, supreme agility, made it obsolete by 1944. Jiro Horikoshi, the Zero's creator, lived to see his masterpiece become synonymous with kamikaze attacks rather than aerial superiority. In his post-war memoirs, he wrote with profound regret, "I designed the Zero to protect Japan and its pilots. Instead, it became the instrument of their destruction. No engineer should have to witness his creation used to waste so many young lives." The B-29 superfortresses that dropped the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki encountered no air resistance. The Zero, which had once seemed invincible, was no longer capable of defending Japan's skies. The Zero's story is ultimately one of tragic transformation. It began as a miracle of engineering, an aircraft that seemed to defy the laws of physics and the expectations of its enemies. For nearly 2 years, it ruled the Pacific skies with an almost supernatural dominance. But the very qualities that made it great also contained the seeds of its destruction. Its extreme lightness made it fragile. Its emphasis on agility over protection left pilots vulnerable. Its complex manufacturing requirements limited production. And most tragically, its philosophy of relying on pilot skill rather than aircraft survivability meant that when those pilots were lost, they couldn't be replaced. The 90% casualty rate among Zero pilots wasn't just a statistic, it was the inevitable result of a design philosophy that prioritized short-term tactical advantage over long-term strategic sustainability. In the end, the Zero serves as a reminder that in warfare, as in engineering, perfection is often the enemy of good. The aircraft that seemed perfect in 1940 became a death trap by 1945, not because it became worse, but because the world around it evolved while it could not. The men who flew it, from the elite veterans of Pearl Harbor to the teenage kamikaze pilots of 1945, paid the ultimate price for this inflexibility. Their sacrifice transformed the Zero from a symbol of Japanese technological triumph into one of war's most tragic aircraft. Perhaps that's the most important lesson the Zero teaches us, that true success in any endeavor isn't about achieving perfection, but about maintaining the ability to adapt, evolve, and survive.